Hello and welcome to the Student Experience podcast, where we'll be chatting to members of the University of Suffolk community, giving them the opportunity to share their experience of us. I'm Sam and I'm a member of the Student Experience and Engagement team, and in today's episode we are joined by Christopher Hill, who is the Royal Literary Fellow at the university. We discussed his role at the university, as well as a chat about his work as a children's author and playwright. So Christopher, thanks for joining us today. I'd like to introduce yourself and your role at the university.
Yes, I'm Christopher William Hill and I'm the Royal Literary Fund Fellow at the University of Suffolk, and which means that I'm parachuted in and I can talk to anybody from any academic discipline, ideally about the nitty-gritty of putting essays together or thesis, anything that they want to talk to me about, really, to do with academic writing.
Perfect. So in terms of specifically ways that you support students, I guess they can come in with essays and things that they've written, and you can sort of take a detailed look at it. And
yeah, absolutely. I think it's always really nice to speak to somebody. I'm assuming it's really nice to speak to somebody because that somebody is me, so I'm just trying to guess what that experience is like. Yeah. Nice to speak to somebody who isn't actually responsible for marking your work. So, as I said, I can talk to anybody, academic staff as well, actually. Sometimes academic staff come in and speak to me about the finer points of writing and trying to communicate in a way that is readable, and ideally enjoyable when you read it, because I think I'm certainly looking back to my days as an undergraduate. It was all smoke and mirrors. I think I tried to throw as many intelligent-sounding words at the page as I possibly could, and didn't really think about the experience of actually reading that piece of work, which has to be the thing that you think about first. And too many words, especially words that we don't always understand quite as fully as we would like to, really throw the reader. It's like hitting a sleeping policeman in the road. You think, I don't know what's going on here, and you have to go back and start all over again. And trying, I think, always to make the experience of reading a piece of academic work as visual as possible, allowing the reader to have a mental image of something when they're reading work. Because again, if it becomes too jargon-based, if too many fancy, flowery words are thrown around, again, you don't really always have a very strong image of anything in your mind. So if I can get a sense of the people that are being written about, or the concepts that are being written about in a way that is visual, bingo, I love that. So trying always to encourage people to think in that way, because I think that's hopefully what a Royal Literary Fund Fellow can bring. Because if I'm writing a novel, I'm always trying to get a reader to think images in their minds.
That's fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Royal Literary Fund itself?
Yeah, so for over 20 years now, the Royal Literary Fund has been sending writers into universities around the country. So there are lots of other fellows. I think there are about 5 of us in the East Anglia area.
Okay.
So we meet up from time to time and share notes and have nice lunches. And the responsibility, I think, is always to encourage writers. But to encourage writers to bring what they know about creative writing to academic writing. So it's quite a different way of working for me. I'm used to talking to creative writers. I do lots of talks to creative writers, encouraging them to think about creating character or situation, think about plotting. And it's flipping that, I suppose, so it suddenly becomes applicable to people that are writing essays. And I think the frustration for me is thinking, again, back to my undergraduate days, if only I'd spoken to a Royal Literary Fund Fellow then, because I think I would have had a much better idea about how to put an essay together. Because the plotting that we think through when we're putting a story together is really the same plotting that you're looking for if you're putting a decent essay together. You're thinking about how you drive that plot forward. Plot, argument, I think they're not dissimilar things. So yeah, the job really, I think, of the fellow is to come in, to be kind, to be approachable, somebody that you might want to spend 50 minutes with, because that's how long the tutorials are, and talk in a safe environment about what is perhaps sometimes holding the student, again, or academic back from writing a piece of work in the most lucid, clear, approachable way possible. And then sometimes it is about something as simple as plotting. You're writing a 5,000 word dissertation. How do you break that up? How do you break that into manageable chunks? So I think we're sort of often falling back on, in a good way, falling back sounds negative, I don't mean it in a negative way, falling back in the positive way on analogies that we think about as creative writers. So I always like to think of stepping stones. I grew up in Cornwall and I knew this creek very well. And it always had these algae-covered stepping stones that took us from one bank of the creek to the other. And if you spent too long or tried to go back, you would almost certainly slip and tip headfirst into the water. So you had to keep driving forward. An essay is like that, I think.
Yes,
if you don't keep pushing forward and go back over the same territory over and over and over again, it confuses the reader. But again, little bit by little bit, stepping stone by stepping stone, you're advancing your argument, you're pushing the story forward until you get from this bank, the introduction, to that bank, the conclusion.
I think you mentioned that you're sort of independent, you're not the one that's marking the student's work. And I think something which I found when I was a student is when you're writing, you assume that the reader knows what you're talking about already.
Yes.
Whereas for you can sort of say, well, what is that? Like, a specific, word or phrase which they assume that people know. That's not necessarily the case.
No, I think that's true. And I think what I've done probably more than anything else in tutorials is try to encourage people to think that if they were handing over a hard copy of their finished essay to the tutor that's about to mark it, if a person with no knowledge of the subject could sweep in, or swoop in, I should say, and pick up that document and take it away into the corner to read, ideally they should be able to understand it. It's not about trying to make something impossible for somebody with no specialist knowledge to make sense of. What would be the point in that? But again, I think we feel sometimes that passed down through the generations, there's a certain way of writing an essay, and it's about baffling people as much as possible. But again, thinking about my own experiences as an undergraduate, but also teaching at undergraduate level and postgraduate level, you've got to think about the needs of the person marking the essay as well. You want to keep the subject fresh for the person that set the essay. And that's one of the really good things here, actually talking to lots of students, the really wonderful guidance they're getting from their tutors, little hints and tips to help them communicate. And I think that's wonderful. But still, it's very hard, I think, to shake off that idea that unless you're baffling the reader, you're doing something wrong, which I think is completely untrue. Yeah,
you feel like you have to put in particular words that, they sound more gravitas, but you don't need them necessarily.
Yeah, I think it's also about trying to keep a little bit of the voice of that writer in play. Because if you're couching something in a way that looks as though it could have been written by any other student, well, what's the point, I think? And it's a journey, I think, as an undergraduate or postgraduate. You're learning, you're training yourself, you're finding ways to communicate as succinctly and smoothly as possible. But I think over time, bringing more and more of yourself to the game. It's not about talking in a way that's not academic. It's just communicating as efficiently as possible, I think. But in a way that gives you an idea of what the writer is thinking, rather than what writers in the past were thinking. It's not about constantly taking information, digesting it, and splurging it on the page, because an AI program could do that, which is a terrifying thought, which I've now terrified myself with. But it's about it's about bringing what makes us human to the page. And if, as a reader, I can get an understanding of why it is a student is interested in the subject that they're studying, well, again, I think that's fantastic.
It's so interesting to hear about your perspective of the individuality of the writer as well, which I think often we might link closer to creative writing, and perhaps it's helping students to think about that in academic writing as well, because it's so transferable, as you've just explained. If a student was to wish to book a session with you, or equally a staff member, can you explain to us how they would do that?
There are lots of flyers and posters dotted around the university. If you can't find the email address for me, I would encourage people to speak to their tutors. Now, I should be able to recall that email address off the top of my head, but I can't. I can't do that immediately. But I'm not difficult to find. Yes, to send me an email in the first instance, and I will send information back, and they can book onto a Calendly link and book a slot with me.
Are you on campus on a weekly basis? Does it fluctuate depending on needs?
I am. It's 2 days a week, and obviously we're right at the end of this academic term, so I've got another 2 weeks here. And but yes, it's 2 days, 2 days a week, and it's normally at the moment Tuesdays and Wednesdays.
Okay, fantastic.
That's really helpful. So thanks for sharing all that. Something that we like to do on the podcast is find a bit more about yourself. And so firstly, what was it about this role at the university that first attracted you? Because I know you said you were from Cornwall initially, and potentially you moved to Suffolk as a result, or?
Well, I've moved around a bit, actually. I lived in London for 10 years and technically live in Dorset now, but I moved back to Chelmsford a couple of years ago because I've been looking after my mother-in-law who's had dementia, and so that's been an interesting journey. And for somebody like me, fascinated by language, that's been a really interesting journey. I move around a bit, but because of the work that I do, I spend an awful lot of time in trains. Traveling all over the place most of the time.
That's cool. So, how did the role here initially come up for you?
I applied a couple of years ago. I'd wanted to apply a long time ago. A couple of friends of mine have been Royal Literary Fund Fellows in the past. I think it was the fascination about speaking to people who are studying courses that are very different to what I studied and the things that I perhaps am normally interested in. Because anybody, I think I said before, from any academic discipline can come in and speak to the fellow. So I could just as easily be talking to a creative writer as a nursing student or a mental health student. And it gives me... It would be nice to think that it was entirely altruistic, and I'm here absolutely for the benefit of the students. You know, it's me greedily trying to claw something back and get an understanding of subjects that I've had no knowledge of, because you never know what might be useful as a writer. It's always about the building up of information. A few people have come into the office over the past year, and I thought, now there's an interesting thing to write about, interesting subject that I'd never thought about before.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that sticks out for you in particular? Is there a specific course that it was, or a topic, a module?
No, I think it's the range of subjects. Yes. I think, and occasionally somebody will come in and you think, well, this is a very obscure thing that you're talking about, but actually I have a little bit of an interest in that subject myself. So things do occasionally come up, and I feel that I'm speaking to them not just as a writer, but also as an enthusiast about quite an arcane subject.
Has it helped your creative writing at all?
Yeah, I think it really has, because you start to look at your work in a different way, and I've always felt this if I'm talking to creative writers. That you suddenly remind yourself why it is you do something in a certain way, or how to stop doing something in a certain way. That's also important. But actually realising that whatever you're writing, it needs to be structured well. Otherwise, the idea falls apart completely. I think I can take that back to my creative writing, definitely. I'm somebody, I think, who tends to write instinctively, I'm not somebody who plans and plans and plans in advance, because I think it kills the idea dead, and I want to keep things as fresh as possible. So I'll have a vague idea about where an idea might be taking me. It might be a couple of lines of dialogue. It might be an image that's really rooted in my mind. But I always say to students, again, creative and academic writers, it's like writing the introduction to an essay before you've written the essay. How can you be a map maker for a land that you haven't explored yet? So yeah, lots of things have come up that absolutely I can take away as a creative writer. But that's the thing that has surprised me so much, that the two things are interchangeable. And you're talking a few minutes ago about the difference between creative and academic writing, and I'm not sure that it is that big a difference. I think we feel that it is, and I think that's why sometimes I do see students coming in who are in, an agony of what do I write? How do I make it sound academic enough, when that isn't always the approach? How do I write something that lays out clearly the thoughts that I have about this particular question, backed up by this relevant information? It's not dissimilar, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you're both in both scenarios. You're telling the story. You go from the beginning till the end.
Yeah.
So.
I think that is something that seems to be a bit of a light bulb moment, and I'd like to say that it's my own my own idea, but it's from talking to other fellows, encouraging people to see academic writing as a creative process, and then it somehow becomes less scary. But tell somebody they've got to sit down and write an academic essay. Gosh, I mean, that would send most people running for the hills.
Absolutely. So, can you describe what a typical day would look like for you at the university? Does it change a lot day by day?
No, not very much. Sometimes inevitably you see more students on some days than on others. I think it does feel a little bit at times like the Royal Literary Fund Fellow is a best kept secret, and I think it's partly because my office is tucked away on the second floor of the waterfront building, and I'm hard to stumble upon. But it's I think I said before, 50-minute chunks of time. It seems a long time until you actually start talking, and then you wish that you had an hour and a half to talk through a subject, and then I have a little bit of decompression time before I speak to the next student, and that's it, really. At reading work in advance, we normally encourage people to send in 500 or 1,000 words, up to about 1,000 words before the session. But some people don't have anything that they want me to read. They just want to come in and talk about why they might be struggling to come up with 500 or 1,000 words. So I can talk them through that as well. I think that's the thing to remind people that it is a no pressure meeting. People can come in. Somebody came in a couple of weeks ago and only had a couple of questions. They didn't want to talk for the full 50 minutes, which is absolutely fine. But I am there for the full 50 minutes if somebody wants to talk through their work. We're not really there, the fellows, as an editorial service. So we don't go through an entire document and give proofreading feedback. That's not really the purpose of the fellow. But sometimes it's about pointing out little problems that are occurring sometimes over and over and over again in the chunks of work that we read, trying to correct those whenever we can. But again, sometimes it is because people know that a fancy word should be there, and often encouraging people to take things out, to find the simplest way of communicating, rather than the floweriest.
Yeah. So I mean, it sounds like you really enjoy your role. You can sense that from listening to it.
It's lovely. It sounds ridiculous to say it's a really good fun experience, but it is.
Yeah.
And the people that I've had, it's a real mix of mature students, students who are straight out of A-levels, quite a mix of people. But the one thing I think that has characterised all of them is an enthusiasm. And an enthusiasm to put things right. If they feel that there is something that's going awry with their writing, they want to try to deal with that, to correct that problem. And in that sense, it feels like, I'm speaking to people who are passionate about their subject, and I'm passionate about writing. So it's a meeting of minds, I think.
Do you have a favourite part about your job? If you were to pick one aspect, is there something that you love in particular about this role, other than what you've just delved into?
Yeah, I'm trying to think what specifically. I think it's the challenge of trying very quickly to get my head round a subject. I mean, occasionally I'll do a little bit of extra research, but again, it's not really about doing that. It's about seeing what the document that I'm reading is saying about the subject. So I don't want to go in with too much specialist knowledge, because I don't feel that's my responsibility. But again, I sort of want to tell you some of the discussions I've had with people, but again, I take the responsibility of making sure that they are confidential meetings very, very seriously. But it is sometimes for me, I think, a little eureka moment where I go, oh, I understood something that I didn't think I understood. Hurrah for me! That sounds terribly self-congratulatory, and in a way, I think it is.
So I guess you sort of mentioned it there about you reading around a subject if you don't know it as much. Is that one of the biggest challenges you faced? Has there been any other challenges that?
Well, I'm not sure that it is the challenge that I thought it was going to be. I expected to be so thrown by the subject matter that I was reading about, but actually that hasn't really happened. I think occasionally you read a document that's more impenetrable than other documents that you read, other essays or theses, whatever. But no, I've been surprised at how I don't blow my own horn. That sounds like, and it isn't what I mean either. I'm digging a terrible trap for myself, and I'm trying to avoid it. I'm skirting around the edge of that trap. I think it's, I think, even now I can be intimidated by academic writing. I think that's it. Writing creatively feels quite safe because you're creating characters where there were none. You're creating situations where there were none. But with academic writing, it feels grounded and rooted in some truth that is unshakable. So I think I did come with a certain amount of trepidation about that, and I don't think there's anything wrong in admitting that, actually. If you go in far too confident about things, then I think everything will unravel very quickly. So, I like to come with a little bit of humility if I can, and but I think that's the thing, because mostly people do want to communicate the enthusiasm they have for the subject. That's the thing that prevents a barrier forming between me and something that I have no prior knowledge about. How about that? I made a brave stab at answering that question.
That was good. I think that was good.
Did I get away with it? I'm not sure.
No, absolutely. We'd love to know a bit more, Christopher, as well, about your background, yourself as a children's author, I understand, as a playwright as well. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that? I think it'd be really interesting to hear.
Well, I started writing when I was a teenager, and I would write plays which we performed at sixth form, and a very good friend of mine at sixth form was also somebody that was interested in writing plays. So I would write things for him and he would write things for me, and he's gone on to write professionally, and obviously I write professionally as well, and we had a lot of support at sixth form to write our own material, which was great. I think that's what you need at an early age, people that are indulgent and will allow you to experiment with your work. And I went to the University of Kent and I did a 4-year drama degree. and specialised in my final year in theatre direction. But we had a very, very good playwriting course, and again, we had lots of encouragement. So I took a play up to Edinburgh in 1995, which is a million years ago now. Dinosaurs died out, then there was 1995, and it was terrible. It was a really, truly awful play, and it got absolutely mauled by any reviewers who were foolish enough to come and watch it. Although I remember somebody in the cast very creatively was saying that there were 4 stars in the Scotsman newspaper if you bought it twice, which I think is the perfect way to try and sell a show on the streets of Edinburgh. But it was so awful, and I think I learnt a lot from having a play that was that bad. I mean, I'm claiming full responsibility for that. And the following year, we took another play to Edinburgh, and that got good reviews, which was lovely, and that was in my 3rd year. So in my final year at university, I had good reviews, and I was able to start making contact with theatre companies, and I mean, I got a lot of rejections, and this was in the day when you would send out a full hard copy of the script, and there would be this terribly depressing thump noise in the morning where you could hear the jiffy bagged script being returned through the letterbox. That was a very, very depressing time, but there were some people that were interested. So I left university and went back to Cornwall, and I worked in a shop for a year, past times, selling reproduction tat from the past to the over 60s. It was a lovely shop to work in. I had a very lovely manager who was tremendously kind and supportive, and it was great. But by the end of that year, had sold 3 plays, and I was finding it quite difficult to juggle the writing and working in the shop.
Wow.
Although this is the terrible thing, though. The moment that you give up and become a writer full time, you think, "Oh, I wish I was still working in a shop." And I was talking to a German theatre designer who was working on a play of mine a few years ago, and I said, "Do you ever just want to work in a shop?" And he said, "Yeah, vegetables or ironmongery." And I thought, you've actually given this some thought. Vegetables or ironmongery, wonderful. I mean, living in Cornwall was difficult because you spent so much time on sleeper trains going up to London or beyond for meetings, and then I started to write for the radio, which was lovely. So comedy series and single dramas, which is a really enjoyable thing to do. And normally, if you're recording an afternoon drama, it's recorded over 2 days, so it's never long enough for actors to start hating each other. That's rather jolly. And then I moved into writing children's books. I felt a bit of a fraud, really, because I'd come from a theatre writing background, but I really wanted to write a children's book. So my first book was called Osbert the Avenger. And so it's a mix of things now, really. Writing, talking to writers, academic writers here, but I also do a lot of residential teaching for the Arvon Foundation. So you're tucked away in a very nice house somewhere in the UK, talking to writers for a week, and it's a lovely job to have.
It's so interesting as well to hear that for all of your successes, after you graduated, you also started in a shop, which I think is a very familiar experience for lots of graduates. Sometimes you don't leap straight into the career you expected.
No. I couldn't agree more. But I think that was the worrying thing recently. The kind of the insistence almost that you had to get work in the subject that you were studying within 6 months of graduating. And I thought, how desperately unrealistic, especially if you've been studying a creative subject. How many people leave and then within 6 months have had their first play accepted or their first book published? It just doesn't happen like that. I mean, in most cases, if you've sold a book, it might be many months before it hits the bookshelves. And I thought, well, don't penalise people who want to study a creative subject and then go off and work in that particular sphere, because it does take time, and you can get punished anyway by people paying you slowly or work drying up. That's punishment enough. You don't need to be forced into thinking that you're a failure if you haven't got work within 6 months. It takes time, I think. People are much more enlightened on the continent about creative people. We're so Philistine, I think, when it comes to creative jobs over here. Creative people need support.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if we look back to at the beginning of a student's experience, right when they start out as a new student, perhaps fresh from school, perhaps joining the university from another career, what is one piece of advice that you could give them related to the Royal Literary Fund and your role, or in general? What would you tell them?
Don't forget who you are as a writer, as a person. I don't ever want to read something that could have been written by anybody else. I want to know what it is that makes a writer unique, even if it's not somebody that I'm going to speak to. If this is general advice that I'm trying to impart, wisdom from decades of working professionally. I think as a creative writer myself, when I started, I think you don't write in a vacuum all the time. You're thinking, well, I should write like this or I should write like that. And then there is a light bulb moment, hopefully sooner or later, where you go, well, this is who I am. And occasionally people will say, well, that is your voice, Christopher. And I go, oh, right, okay. I maybe I understand that a little bit more now. What makes me as a writer. So for me, I've got a real interest in black humour. My mum was a nurse, and I think I inherited a lot of her dark humour. So it's making sure that you're always bringing yourself to the work that you're producing.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Find your own voice.
Find your own voice. Yeah.
That's good. That's a good answer. We've come to the final question now, which is what we call our answer one, ask one. So you're going to answer a question from the previous guest, and you're going to pose one to the next guest.
Oh, right, okay.
So
I'm mulling already.
Our previous guest was actually a PhD student doing sort of a creative writing sort of type of course, so it's worked out quite well. So her question, which is a simple question but might actually be quite difficult, and her question was, what is your favourite book?
Oh, my favourite book? That's tremendously difficult. And unfair. As well, I think. While I am considering that, I'm going to throw this out. How about this? What is your worst writing habit? For your next yes, which again can apply to creative writers or academic writers, but what is your worst writing habit? It could be procrastination, it could be anything, but I'm going to say it's a children's book, The Children of Green Know by Lucy M. Boston. It's a wonderful book from the 1950s. I'm right in saying that, and if you don't come away from reading that book believing that ghosts exist, then I don't think the book has worked its magic in the way it normally does. I've written about this before as one of my favourite books. When I was growing up in the 1980s, there was a BBC children's TV adaptation of the book, which was very transporting. But it reminds me of my maternal grandmother a lot. So it's a really transporting book for me. And Lucy M. Boston was very good on detail, and I'm fascinated by detail, as most writers are. It's not the big picture necessarily, but what something tastes like, what something smells like, the sensory experiences that you can encourage a reader to believe that they have themselves experienced. Children of Green Know.
Okay, that's cool. And how about a book your favourite book that you'd recommend someone to read?
See, this is a sort of question in two parts. I feel that I should have been primed for this. Well, I mean, in a way, I want to say the same book. because if I was recommending something to a creative writer, again, because the detail, it would probably be that. And there are so many. That's the awful thing. You want to recommend everything, but I suppose from a plotting point of view, pretty much anything by Agatha Christie. I'm a big crime junkie, but just to see the way a plot is put together, and again, useful for creative and academic writers, because that plotting is the structure that you're looking for in a good piece of academic writing. I think that this point leads to that point, leads to that point. But if you take away any of those individual points, then the whole thing starts to collapse. Yes, Murder on the Orient Express. How about that?
That's a good one. Thanks again for joining us, Christopher.
It's been lovely. Thank you for having me.
So until next time, it's goodbye from Lily.
Thank you so much for having us.
It's goodbye from me. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Student Experience podcast. If you would like to be a future guest, email studentexperiencesteam@uos.ac.uk or follow the links to our podcast application form through our Brightspace page. You can also reach out to us through our Instagram page, UOS_student experience.